Okay, so covered part one already, which really just talked about some of the gross anatomy and two fairly basic structures in the meninges and the ventricles. Part two gets into a little bit more detail about the lobes and then some specific internal structures and what they do. So we're going to break up the cerebrum into a bunch of different lobes, or it is broken down into a bunch of different lobes. All right, and so if you look at this image, you can see that we're going to talk about the frontal lobe, which is in blue, the parietal lobe, which is in purple, the occipital lobe in green, and the temporal lobe in yellow. Right? And so what is important to keep in mind is that we're going to talk about a bunch of different functions, some specific structures located within each lobe. And so keep in mind, like, I only want one or two sentences to give these to give the function, 2 sentences at the most. Okay, so if you notice that the names of the lobes correspond with the name of the cranial muscle, cranial bones that they are associated with. So the frontal lobe is going to associate, is located in the frontal, underneath the frontal bone, and you're dealing here with voluntary motor functions, social judgment, planning, general mood. Those things are all come from the frontal lobe. The parietal is dealing with sensory reception and integration, more or less. The occipital lobe is dealing primarily with vision, and the temporal lobe is dealing with kind of sensations in the sense of hearing, smell, emotional behavior, taste, things like that. And a little bit more detail, and we'll kind of get into some of these videos again in lab, but the frontal lobe, again, is dealing with higher thought function. Some specific structures we want you to be aware of are, first, what's called Broca's area. And here you're dealing with motor speech, right? So the motor production. And you can look at the precentral gyrus. You can see it labeled in darker blue on that image, and that's what's known as the primary motor cortex. And the primary motor cortex is going to be dealing primarily with motor control. And so Broca's area falls under, or is associated with a portion of that, and it's going to again be dealing with motor production. So we'll watch this image, kind of what's called Broca's aphasia, which is this classic study, primarily in psychology, but it's showing when there's damage to that area, you're usually dealing with it's very difficult for people to produce the words. So the motor skills necessary to actually form the words is difficult, but the meaning of the word is upheld. Right. The other structure the last structure you need to be aware of is the central sulcus. And this is what's forming the posterior border between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And so the precentral gyrus makes sense in that it's the ridge that comes before the central sulcus. And the sulcus, again, is a depression. And you'll see these images pop up now and again, and they're called the motor homunculus or a sensory homunculus. And what they are is that homunculus literally means little man in the brain. And he's not actually a little man, but what it is a representation of the areas of the precentral and the postcentral gyrus, and specifically the amount of those areas that is committed to doing certain things. And so if you look in the top image, that is showing the motor cortex, and it's showing the relative amount of area committed to those skills. So if you were to damage a medial portion of your precentral gyrus, you'd be dealing with something with motor production of the toes. So if you look all the way to the right, that's kind of the internal portion, and so you're going down into the longitudinal fissure, and what you hit is that first little part is dealing with the toes, and then it works its way up through some of the extremities, eventually getting to the face. And if you look, there's a lot of area committed to the tongue and to the mouth in general. It's almost like almost a third is committed to a very small area. It's interesting to think about how that translates to what we are as a species. We are very talkative, I guess, and we deal a lot with our tongues and with movements and with communication, and that's because a lot of our brain is committed to doing that, or vice versa. So the way that they really figured out what the brain does is usually through things going catastrophically wrong. And this guy Phineas Gage is one of these classic examples. He was this railroad worker in the early to mid 1800s, and he was working in a tunnel, and he's just hammering away, and this railroad tie basically blew out and busted through his frontal lobe. And back in those days, you were pretty much toast at that point. However, this guy lived, but his frontal lobe was just obliterated. And there's this study where they basically followed this guy around and looked at, and that's how they figured out that the frontal lobe controls a lot of this higher thought or this social judgment, because he was basically a man. He became a man with this kind of child or ape-like desires, just unfiltered, and when he wanted something, he would go up and act violently to take it. And so what was interesting also is that this kind of led to the whole field of using lobotomies to treat certain disorders like schizophrenia or clinical depression. They would just remove parts of the brain that were associated with it. If you've ever seen or read the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that's effectively what they've done at the end. They've removed, sorry to spoil it for you, but they removed a portion of the brain, and that's how they would treat people that they couldn't treat medically. Okay, so the parietal lobe, again, we've already hinted at this. It has the postcentral gyrus, which is shown in kind of the darker purple, and again, this is dealing with somatosensory type skills. Right, so sensory integration, things kind of pass through here and then become integrated or interpreted. And so if you look at the visual representation, right, so that homunculus that we showed with the motor, that little man, there's one that goes not only for the motor skill, which is associated with the precentral gyrus, there's one also with the postcentral gyrus. And I think this is shown on page 278 in your lab manuals. Right, and so they kind of, as we had Broca's area on the frontal lobe dealing with motor skills, you have what's termed Wernicke's area, which kind of goes over the temporal portion of the brain as well, but you're dealing also, again, with some of the post-central gyrus a little bit. But you can see in that image in green, you have some temporal, you have a little bit of the occipital, and then a lot of the parietal lobe. And Wernicke's area is again dealing with language formation. And we'll watch that video, or you can Google Wernicke's aphasia at home and watch some videos of people who suffer from this. And they usually don't have any issue with producing language, but the actual meaning of the words is lost. And this is, and they know that they are saying gibberish, they just don't have the ability to fix it. So it's pretty, you can imagine it being pretty frustrating as a disease or a disorder. Right, next is the occipital lobe, shown in green. Again, we're dealing with primary visual cortex, and if you hit the back of your head, this is why you see stars, is that you're stimulated these neurons into firing, nothing specifically, but you're going to get some sensations associated with that, and that's going to be seeing little light flashes. The only structure you need to be aware of here is the occipital lobe. Right below it is what's called the transverse sulcus, and that's what separates the cerebellum from the occipital lobe and also the temporal lobe. Right, so we've talked about a couple of big sulci so far. We've talked about the central sulcus, we've talked about the longitudinal fissure, we've talked about the transverse sulcus. The last major structure is the lateral sulcus, and that's associated with the temporal lobe, mainly separating the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and also the occipital lobe. So again, the transverse sulcus separates the occipital from the cerebellum. The the lateral sulcus separates the temporal lobe from all the other lobes, and then the central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. All right, so as we move on, we talk a little bit more about some of these structures that we hinted at earlier. The cerebral hemispheres, right? You have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and you're dealing with different specializations. And the fact that the hemispheres are specialized is why they think that humans are different from the rest of the animal kingdom. It's because our hemispheres are specialized to do certain things, and this translates to certain evolutionary advantages and the ability to kind of our brains to become much more efficient in what they do. So the left hemisphere is generally where you see language and reasoning, and the right hemisphere you're dealing more with artistic awareness, imagination, music comprehension, GPS, the GPS part, space and pattern perception. The hemispheres are separated by the longitudinal fissure and then connected by a structure called the corpus callosum. And so this is like a little, almost an ear-shaped body that is going to sit and connect the two hemispheres and allow communication to occur between the two. And here's just a kind of a breakdown of people, where do you fall as an individual in terms of if you're left hemisphere or right hemisphere. And obviously it's never really this clear cut. It often tends to be people tend to be certain things in certain areas they're better at, but generally left hemisphere you're going to be stimulated by nonfiction. So you like the history books, you like games that follow very specific rules, such as chess, and that you can kind of work your way in a very logical manner, versus someone who's right hemisphere dominant, kind of seeing the big picture, less of that rules, but kind of seeing the general flow or the feel of how things fit together. This suits well for people who are very artistic in the sense that they can intuitively feel what colors or what images go well together. And then you have people that are midbrain dominant as well, and then they kind of go between the two. Sometimes they're very logical, sometimes they are also very kind of dreamy. And so it's interesting to see certain people that a lot of their behavior is dictated by the brain, the parts of the brain that they are dominant in. All right, so again, we're going to hit this corpus callosum. This is a structure that connects the two hemispheres, and we'll watch this really interesting video of what that means. What is the significance of our brains communicating, the hemispheres communicating with each other? We just talked about how certain areas or certain hemispheres are specialized to do certain things. Well, what happens when those brains or those hemispheres can no longer communicate? And the reason the corpus callosum may be cut is because people that suffer from grand mal seizures are basically this feedback, this electrical signal that bounces back and forth, and builds until the brain just kind of shuts down and the seizure occurs. A way to treat that is to cut this corpus callosum, so you're basically breaking that ping pong action of electrical signals. But there are consequences that are associated with that. And we'll watch this really interesting video of what happens when the brain that corpus callosum is cut and those hemispheres cannot communicate. All right, now we're going to get into some of these specific structures, and what I want you to be able to do is, again, give me a very brief definition of the function, but be able to identify it. And the thalamus is the first one we're going to start with, and thalamus means little room or chamber, and it's located within the corpus callosum. All right, and so what you can see here is that basically this is the UPS of the brain. it's going to receive nearly all the information on that's going its way to the cerebral cortex and then direct it to the appropriate spot. Right? And so again, the thalamus is integrating and directing information, kind of like the post office or the UPS. And it's going to help, it's also involved with regulating sleep and when you're feeling tired and things like that. The next structure is the hypothalamus. Remember that hypo means below, so this is a structure that's below the thalamus. And again, I just want a real brief definition of it. And so you can talk about autonomic nervous system control, sleep regulation, thirst, hormone secretion, and so you're really going to get into a little bit more detail in 202. The next one is the epithalamus. Remember that epi means on or above, and so this is called the pineal gland, right? And so it's just another term for it. And you're dealing here with the circadian rhythms, right? And so the circadian rhythms are our light cycle. So when we kind of know that we kind of get affected by the amount of light in the day, and so that's kind of, again, regulating sleep and wakefulness. The structure, or that lizard-like thing, it's called a tuatara. It's a relative of the lizard, not actually a lizard itself. Sometimes it's called the third eye, and the tuatara actually has a thin membrane in its skull, an opening that goes directly to the epithalamus, or right to the pineal gland. So it has very specific structure, or very specific links to the light and the length of the light, and it deals with also kind of for animals, for more of the animal kingdom in terms of regulating sexual drive and things like that. The other structure, kind of affiliated, it's just deep or just inferior to the hypothalamus, is the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland we should be able to see in the dissections, and you're dealing with growth, the regulation of pregnancy contractions, sexual organ development. So this is a pretty big deal in terms of our development as individuals. Okay, so those are all structures within the forebrain. As we're working our way down, we're going to get into the midbrain, also called the mesencephalon. Cephalon meaning head, meson meaning middle. And so this is the area that contains that cerebral aqueduct that connects the first three ventricles with the fourth ventricle that's located underneath the cerebellum. And there's another structure here called the corpora quadrigemini. And again, we'll break that word down. Corpora basically means body, like corpse. And then quadrigemini means four, and Gemini also means body. So it's basically a quadruplet of bodies or structures, specifically called the colliculi. And this colliculi means little hills. So these four hills that are composed in this structure are dealing with optical reflexes. And so this is the corpora quadrigemini. We'll break these into two kind of groupings: the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus, or the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. And what I would normally talk about with the inferior colliculi is if someone was you're just walking along and you're kind of not paying attention, and somebody slams a book down or makes a loud noise, the first thing you do is orient towards it. So we're very visual creatures, and as you might expect, there's a lot of visual nerves associated with this general area. But what's happening is like we're orienting because we want to, since we're very visual creatures, we are responding to a high noise. We kind of flinch a little bit and orient. That's a result of this structure called the inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi, as shown in that little image of the eye, is our ability to kind of track moving objects. And this is another thing that they will do if you ever see cops or taking a field sobriety test. they will move that finger in front of your eye, and your ability to track it is kind of a sign of if you've been drinking. Because what will happen is that alcohol is going to affect the superior colliculi and make your eye effectively jump or skip, and so it's going to not perform normally, and that's something you don't really have control over. That's a sign of alcohol abuse or ingestion. Okay, so we've talked about the forebrain, talked about the midbrain. Now we're getting to the hindbrain, or the pons, and some specific structures associated with it. So the first one we talk about is the pons, and this is one that is kind of the waypoint between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and you again are dealing with all these kind of autonomic functioning. So sleep, breathing, swallowing, bladder control, maintaining posture. So these are all things that are tied in with the pons, and so the deterioration of those things or diseases affecting those areas are going to affect some of those specific functions that we just mentioned. Okay, so we're finally getting to the cerebellum, another structure within the hindbrain. The cerebellum is what they call the little brain. That's what cerebellum means. And it's almost like a little cerebrum. It has, just as the cerebrum has a left and right hemisphere, you have almost a left and right cerebellum or cerebellar hemispheres. The way that instead of it being kind of separated by the longitudinal fissure, the cerebellum is connected by a structure called the vermis. Right? So the vermis is the structure that connects both the hemispheres. And what you're doing here is with muscular motor control. All right, and that's mostly what it is. And we think about how much has to happen for you to walk, or for you to open something, or to open a door, or to unscrew something. I think that's pretty impressive that we can coordinate our body, or coordinate our muscles. I mean, there's tons of muscles involved in doing all those things, and so this structure, the cerebellum, is really integral in maintaining that. And to make things a little bit more complicated, the structures of the cerebellum that are on the cerebrum called gyri and sulci are called folia for the ridges, and actually just called grooves. All right, so the folia are the ridges and the grooves are the sulci. All right, here's a cross section, a lateral view of the cerebrum, and what we're looking at here is called the arbor vitae. Arbor vitae means tree of life, and here we're looking, and if you look at it, it kind of looks like a little tree. And remember that the gray matter are neurons, or the computers, and the white matter that you see making up the branches are the cables that connect the computers, right? So that those myelinated axons are basically serving as cables within the structure. Okay, and so a couple of things that we can point out here that you can see the superior colliculus, you can see the inferior colliculus, you can see the cerebral aqueduct running to the fourth ventricle. Right? And so just think of these things, these structures that you're starting to see over and over and over again. All right, just a couple more structures in the hindbrain. The medulla oblongata is located just inferior to the pons. It's basically an extension of the spinal cord and dealing with a lot with, again, autonomic functions. So in this case, maintaining heartbeat, or the force of heartbeat. So this is really closely tied with your heart. You're also dealing with swallowing, sexual arousal, right? So you guys all remember Waterboy with something wrong with your medulla oblongata. It's actually really important structure on there, but you're dealing with all this aggression, things like that as well. And so the medulla oblongata, it actually gets its name from the oblong shape of it. And when we look at a cross section of it, when we do the dissections, you can actually see it and distinguish it from the pons by its oblong shape. And so it's interesting, a couple things to kind of take away, I guess, are, hanging's whenever you see a hanging, or if you've ever seen a video, I hope you've never seen a hanging, but if you've ever seen a movie of a hanging, people are strangling, and that's a really bad hanging. A hanging should be basically an instantaneous death, because what you want to do is separate C1 or dislocate C1 and C2 and use the dens, right? So that structure on C2, the second cervical vertebra, also known as the axis, and you want to use it to puncture the medulla oblongata. And if you puncture the medulla oblongata, basically the heart stops beating, and heart stops beating, it's relatively an instant death. This is also what snipers are trained to aim for. You don't want to shoot the brain. You want to shoot this structure, this right at the base of the brain, right in the hindbrain, the medulla oblongata, which will again stop the heart and cause effectively an instant death. It's kind of interesting to think about how all these alcohol and drugs and brain affect the brain, right? So what's the area that's affecting? How is it affecting? If you look at cocaine, for example, this is altering layers of these feel-good drugs. That's a dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin. These are these things that feel good, and so where those areas specifically located, and it's kind of interesting to break down what specifically is being affected, and that's where a lot of scientists that study these areas focus on only specific parts of the brain, right? So if you look at THC, for example, is going to affect areas of attention, memory, motivation. And let's think about what specific structures in the brain do those things. Right, and so you can kind of go through, and that image of the spider webs is actually one of my favorite studies, or pseudo studies, I guess. But basically what happened is they gave spiders different drugs and looked at how they made spider webs. And the one that affected the most, I always thought was amusing, was caffeine. I mean, it was just totally in disarray. And it's kind of this, not really fully, it was a study done by the Army in I think the 70s or 80s, but it was never really kind of followed up upon. But it's an interesting study nonetheless. And so what you should be able to do eventually is get to the point where you can identify all the specific structures, then give me kind of this specific ID of a function. 2 or 3 words really is all we really need to know in terms of what each function is involved in.